Everybody, I am doing a different type of video lecture this time. I'm going to be doing a screencast video lecture on Module 2, and I'm just playing around with different forms of media. So today I'm going to be talking about chapters 3, 6, and 8, which were the readings for Module 2, and you're going to see my spelling, and I'm going to be correcting myself because I'm going to type some things as I go, and then I'll probably at sometimes jump into Canvas if it's appropriate for that. So the first thing I want to talk about is when I post video lectures and announcements, and that's because this video lecture is coming a little later than I would have liked since this is Saturday, and I apologize for that. This week has been really tough for me, but everybody still has until tomorrow. So Module 2 deadlines are tomorrow on Sunday, and as usual, 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So once you watch this, if you need to edit anything or finish up any work that you need to complete for Module 2, this is going, you still have some time after this video lecture. I also got a question about can you post video lectures the Sunday prior to the module week? And the answer to this is no, and that's because during the weekend what I'm usually doing is grading for the previous module. So like this weekend I'm doing grading for Module 2, and however I don't want video lectures to come this late in the module week. So what I can do is post video lectures on Mondays or Tuesdays of the module week. And so that is my objective. And then hopefully having those video lectures a little bit earlier will be helpful. And I'll make sure to post. I can probably do text posts on, or text announcements on the Sundays prior to that module week. But just because of the way the work flows, and there's no there's not the module weeks are not 5 days, right? So because the module weeks are 7 days rather than 5, it makes it more difficult to do proper prep for the coming module week while you're still wrapping up the first week. So there would be a lot of crossover on my part. So anyways, I'm going to start talking about chapter 3 a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk briefly about what I thought was most valuable from chapters 3, 6, and 8. And then I'm going to talk about, I'll remind everybody of the assignments for this week, and then I'm going to talk about, like I said I would talk about before, which is how I would approach the profile of a place assignment, as well as the thesis for that. So that's just what I'm going to talk about in this video lecture, and then I'll write that here so you can see that. So what I'm going to talk about is going to be what I consider the most valuable takeaways from these chapters, and also the assignments for Module 2, and then how I would approach profile, that word is driving me crazy, profile of a place, and the thesis for this. So that's going to be what I focus on in this particular screencast video lecture. Now I'll go to chapter, that would be weird, chapter 3. And chapter 3 is called Rhetorical Situations. So what this chapter talks about essentially is the main question, which is this word you've been hearing a little bit here and there, is what is rhetoric and what are rhetorical situations? So in terms of the word rhetoric, I'm going to scroll this down a little bit. The word rhetoric itself, and our author talks about this, but it's really the way we go about communicating, and the way we go about persuading. And this has to do with argument, which you'll be doing in the classical argument paper. So a rhetorical situation then, which is really important, and then it's the name of the chapter, and then she talks about some rhetorical, what rhetorical situations are, but rhetorical situations, and she talks also about rhetorical intentions. And both of these terms are really important to know, because it's not for you want your reader to know what the rhetorical situations and rhetorical intentions are, but mostly you as the writer need to know your rhetorical situations and the rhetorical intentions of your own work or of your own argument. So rhetorical, so when she talks about rhetorical intentions, she gives us this list, and this list includes audience, forum, and I'll talk briefly about each one after I list them, topic, genre, author's purpose, and author's role. The most important, I mean, they're all important in terms of rhetorical intentions. For audience, the rhetorical intention of the audience. So going back kind of a little bit to talk about the word rhetoric, and this does come from Aristotle, so it goes way back to Greek times, old stuff. So it starts with Aristotle, who really talks about, how exactly, and just like I talked about in my kind of quick definition here, how do we communicate, and how can we communicate effectively? Sometimes this is called rhetoric is called the art of persuasion in some cases, but you also have what's called the rhetor. And the rhetor is the person using rhetoric. And then we have rhetoricity. These are just variations or paradigms of the word rhetoric. So the rhetoricity is an adjective, right? So it's the way a rhetor uses rhetoric. And those are kind of the main words you want to know. And then there's rhetoric precisely. So I'll give an example. Let me just back up here. So I'll give the example of me using rhetoric to do a screencast video lecture. It doesn't even have to be a screencast, just a video lecture or even just a lecture. So if I'm using a particular type of rhetoric to do a screencast video lecture, in order for me to do this, I have to have an understanding of what your author calls conceptual space, I believe. I'm just going to double check that. Yeah, conceptual space. And this is actually referred to more commonly as discourse communities. And then discourse is, this is a philosophical term. It's not just philosophical, but it's one way to think about it. So I just call it, because it's a larger umbrella, philosophical term that describes or defines what we call the discursive elements of an environment. And our author gives us some examples. Did I spell environment wrong? I can't spell anymore. There we go. Typing, right? And our author gives us some examples of what these conceptual spaces, or what are more commonly referred to as discourse communities. So, for example, the discourse community or conceptual space of football. And this would be, right, so language and behaviors, not spelling it the British way, specific to that discourse community or conceptual space. And language and behaviors, right, so there's going to be football jargon or language that's specific to football. There's going to be uniforms that have particular names to them. You know, like what's that thing they call that they wear around their waist? It looks like a fanny pack, but it's not. I don't know the name for it. There's going to be, you know, what the language that the referees use to dictate the boundaries of the game and who wins and who doesn't win. And there's going to be behaviors that are specific to, right? So the way a footballer would behave and speak in the environment of when they're playing football would be different, or should be different from the way they behave and talk. For example, if they were at their, you know, their a parent's funeral, or somebody's funeral, or a birthday party, or a different discursive environment. So that's going back to rhetorical tensions, and I'm sorry I'm going back and forth here, but going back here, right, you as the writer need to know your rhetorical situations and the rhetorical intentions of your own work and argument. But before all of that, so if I need to understand the rhetorical intention of my audience, I have to know the conceptual space and the discursive environment in which I'm writing. So, for example, if I'm writing about a football game, then I know that my audience is going to be, so if I'm writing about a football game, my audience is going to be people who like football, people who play football, the industry itself. So, you know, we have the NFL and I can't remember, the NCAA, I think is what it is. I don't know why that's dropping from my brain at the moment. So I have to know, like, okay, these are people who I'm potentially writing to, so I need to shape my rhetoric or shape the way that I communicate so that it's for this particular audience. Same thing with the forum, right, where I'm writing. So if I'm writing, you know, in a newspaper, on a blog, an academic paper, right? So there's all these different forums where you can write, and the forum is going to require particular rhetorical intentions, right? So on a blog, if you write an academic paper on a blog, the rhetorical intention might get lost, because on a blog, you're probably like, and these are also genres as well: newspaper, blog, academic paper. So if you go into a blog expecting one thing and you get something else, the rhetorical intention of the writer was lost. The topic, right? You have to know the rhetorical intentions of the topic. So on what you're talking requires you to understand. It requires you to understand how to talk about it. And I've talked about the critical terrain before, but you have to know how the topic is currently and formerly being and been talked about. before you can talk about it. So you can't just enter the conversation just willy-nilly. You have to do the research before. And then genre, of course. So, and I already kind of talked about that with forums. So if I'm writing a newspaper, I'm not going to write a newspaper article the same way I would an academic paper. I'm not going to write, and our author gives us examples of those different types of genres. If I'm writing wow, my mind is so at loss for genre at the moment. I apologize. If I'm writing an op-ed, I'm not going to write that the same way as I would write something else, right? I think that's kind of obvious. So author's purpose and author's role. So the author there are rhetorical intentions. So the author has purpose in terms of what they're writing. And then the author also has a role. So, and that's usually what is the author's relationship to the particular thing they're writing about. Do they have a lot of experience? Do they have investment in it? Or, are they an expert? Are they not an expert? Are they just writing this for fun? That type of thing. So the other thing from chapter 3 are the rhetorical appeals. And these are important because the rhetorical appeals are the way you go about actually facilitating rhetorical intent, and that is through ethos, logos, and pathos. There's others, but this book only talks about the 3, so I'm only going to talk about the 3. And, so rhetoric, it's the way we go about communicating. In particular, it's how we go about persuading. And then in order to be effective at these things, you have to be aware of the various rhetorical situations and the rhetorical intentions of particular things. And then the appeals are the way a writer goes about actually creating or facilitating rhetorical intentions and effectively or ineffectively. So again, if I go on a blog and I find something like an academic paper, I'm going to say, well, there were rhetorical intentions there and there was a rhetorical situation, but the writer failed at it. So you can still do these things, but they can be done not well. So ethos is the appeal to credibility and authority. And logos is the appeal to logic. And pathos is the appeal, to emotion. And usually, whenever I've taught rhetoric in the past, I always teach them with advertisements are a very common way and an easier entry into analyzing rhetoric or doing a rhetorical analysis of a piece. So you can look at a static commercial, so like something that's printed in a magazine, or a moving commercial like you would see on TV, and talk about how is this company going about using ethos, logos, and pathos to try to be persuasive. So appealing to credibility and authority would be, who is writing this particular thing? Do they have expertise on it? How credible of a person are they? So it's all about, well, they know what they're talking about, so I'm definitely going to, buy this product, or I'm definitely going to vote for this person, or I'm definitely going to go into this degree program, or whatever it is, right? Because you feel like the message that's being conveyed to you is demonstrating strong credibility, right, or authority. So like if something is published from Harvard University versus, say, a high school, right? If Harvard University and a random high school are arguing for the same things, you'd probably say, well, Harvard University probably has more credibility and authority than this random high school. So we might prefer to go along with whatever the Harvard University piece is saying, just because that name is attached to a lot of ideas and presumed credibility and presumed authority. Appealing to logic is usually comes at the or in the form of, like, it's not always statistics, but statistics, but it's usually, what we call, or it's really what I call lines of logic, which is if this, then that, and then, right? So, and this is very, very common. These are ethos, logos, and pathos are all common in political rhetoric, but sometimes it's easiest to explain them through political rhetoric. So very common in logos, very common in political rhetoric. So, for example, right, if you vote for X, then you will get Y, right? There's no statistics in there, but it's presenting a type of logic. And, right, if this, then that, right? Just like in math. So, and they don't, and the writing doesn't explicitly have to say if this, then that. They might say it in a much more surreptitious or, way that is really implicit, but you're getting across this idea. It's what you may call it subliminal, but it doesn't have to be as kind of suppressed as subliminal messages, but logic is being spewed at you, and so you're kind of like, oh, okay, or sometimes with charity, right? If I give to this charity, then I know that this thing is going to get better because I'm helping to, do whatever. So, but then people also use statistics to also form lines of logic. So, right, 96% of people who eat this type of food live longer, right? That's an if-then statement. It's just not explicitly if-then. It's, if you eat this food, you have a really high probability of living longer. And then, right, then you would want to say, okay, well, who's saying this? Do they have a credibility or authority? Is it the FDA? I know they're government, but they might not have the most credibility, or they have a really wonky background. So I may need to look further into that. And then there's the appeal to the emotion. So the one example that I always use is the commercial for adopting or helping animals. The one with Sarah McLachlan with the really sad music in the background, and there's the pictures of the animals behind cages and bars, and that's appealing to it's a rhetorical appealing to types of emotions. So you might feel sad, you might feel guilty, you might feel like you need to adopt something, you might feel like you need to provide money to this organization, but it's appealing to emotions. So those are the different types of rhetorical appeals. Okay, and so that's really what chapter 3 talks about. It's just really getting into what is rhetoric, and like I said, like I've talked about before, the idea of rhetoric is going to come up every now and then, but you really want to know I think the most important thing in terms of rhetorical intentions and your own writing is, for example, when I write an introduction, what is the introduction's rhetorical intentions? Right? So the introduction has a variety of rhetorical intentions. And just like a body paragraph has rhetorical intentions, a conclusion has rhetorical intentions, and that the visual guide of an academic essay, I believe is the title. I can't remember. I designed this thing. I can't remember the name of it. That handout, this specifies rhetorical intentions of the different parts of an academic essay. So that's really the objective of that particular handout that I created, that I put on Canvas for everybody. So that goes over, right, in in an introduction, really what is the rhetorical intention of the introduction? Because that's when I'm grading, that's what I'm looking for. Does this introduction meet the rhetorical intentions that it's supposed to be getting across? And it's when it doesn't fulfill the rhetorical intentions that it needs to as an introduction, then that's where we start to need to improve our writing. Okay, so chapter 3 deals with rhetoric. I don't have much to say about chapter 6. So chapter 6 is the introduction to texts that gets capitalized, that inform. And like I said, I don't have much to say about this chapter. It's not a very long chapter, and I'm just looking at my notes really quickly, and it seems like the main question this chapter asks is, how do we go about informing? And really emphasizing that there are different genres. So it's now just kind of cherry picking this idea of, okay, so now there's going to be a variety of texts that inform, and what are those different texts? And on page 82, our author gives us a variety of different texts and what she calls their focused purpose. Sorry, I'm going to add an S in there because she doesn't have one. Their focused purposes. So, for example, she has the journal versus the newspaper, things I've already kind of talked about, newspaper article versus a memo, a brochure. I'm not going to write them all. And then there's some others, right? And then she talks about, okay, in this genre, so this really is a chapter about genre and how the different, or I should say how differing genres inform. So that is how different genres require or have different rhetorical situations and rhetorical intentions. And that goes back to that idea of the conceptual space or the discourse community, because genre, which is the key word in this chapter that I'm not even sure she talks about, I don't remember, but implicitly or explicitly, I think more implicitly, this is a chapter about genre. So based on what you're writing, and I've already kind of talked about this, right? The different genres, these are different genres: journal, newspaper, article, memo, brochure, and the other ones she mentions. And then there's others outside of that. They all require, right? They're all, firstly, they all exist in a different conceptual space and different discourse community. And then from there, those different genres have different rhetorical situations and rhetorical intentions. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last chapter that that everybody was supposed to read for Module 2, and that was called Profile. I thought this chapter was the best chapter of this week because it was the most informative for the specific work that you were doing, for the specific work that you are doing for Module 2. And based on its title, this chapter obviously talks about profile, or the profile genre. So it talks about the profile genre, and it's really good. If you're struggling with the profile of a place assignment, this chapter would be really good for you to read. I underlined a lot of stuff in this chapter for myself, but it talks about, it kind of answers questions like, what is the profile genre? And then gives an answer to that. And then, what is the purpose of this genre? So why is it that we write profiles, or why somebody would write a profile? One of the most critical notes that I think our author reminds us about the profile genre is being selective, and this is on page 110, but being selective regarding the information you provide, and then limiting yourself to specifics that clearly relate to your focus or thesis. This was really important because when writing kind of weirder genres like profile, which isn't that common, and this is where she brings up anecdotes when she talks about limiting yourself to specifics. But when student writers are writing things like profiles or doing critical reflections, which is really what a profile is a critical reflection, student writers tend to I should say, not limit the specifics. They're too broad. And that's general. This is, I would say this is across the board with all writing, is that student writers struggle with being too broad in general and not being specific enough. So in terms of, so now I'm going to talk about the actual assignments. And so before I get to how I would approach the, I'm just going to Canvas, how I would approach the profile of a place. I'm just going to briefly go to Module 2 to remind you of what you're supposed to be completing. You have the APA Where to Find It activity, the use of personal anecdotes, and then using sense details. And so these are all three of these are short writing assignments. But this one is the one that is, like I said in my video announcement earlier this week, this is the one that is a little bit more, it could be more confusing, because writing a profile of a place is not something that we do all the time. I probably, if I've ever done this, I can't remember when I've done it. I'm sure I've done it at some point, but it's just not something that comes up very often. So writing this in a composition classroom can be a little bit scary. So, and I talked about these 5 things in the video announcement. So these are the major criteria for the assignment, but the general explanation of what writing a profile of a place is up here, right? So, and it tells you the purpose, right? So the genre, this assignment is you're writing in the genre of a profile, and it's asking you to profile of a place, and you're supposed to talk about, is to inform readers about a living person, a place visited, or an event attended. So for this assignment, choose a place that you have visited, and then it gives you some examples of that. And then here are some of those criteria, and then down here is where it talks about if you do research on it. And so our author talks about that as well. So our author talks about when you do a profile, you might need to do some outside research just to make sure that you have everything correct in terms of, if you're describing particular an event or a person or any of the 3, a person, place, or event. Sorry, I was just looking through the text to get to page 115. But she talks about that on pages 112 through 115, where she talks about preparation through research. So when you're writing in the profile genre, you may need to do research. You may not need to do research. So in terms of, if we get to the profile of a place assignment, let me make that bigger. So I think, and I already got a question, I've at least had one question about the thesis, what the thesis for this looks like. So I'm going to give an example from my own life that might help with this. I'm not going to write it, but I'm just kind of going to give the pieces of what I would be writing about and what that thesis might look like. So, and one second, let me get my example. So, for my topic, I decided that I would choose an event, and this particular event is hearing Maya Angelou speak at my brother's college graduation. And I will say in 2002 again, because I'm trying to be really specific. So I would choose an event if I were doing this assignment. I would choose an event, or sorry, I would first choose a topic, and I've chosen out of a person, a place, or an event. I've chosen an event. I could potentially also choose Maya Angelou, but as a person, so there may be some crossover in terms of describing a person and also an event, but really it's about the event, which is hearing Maya Angelou speak at my brother's college graduation in 2002. And then I'd want to kind of grab some details. So I would want to describe this. So, well, before I get to details, I would just go to the thesis. So what the thesis would look like for this. And the author talks about the thesis on page 115 of a profile. And the thesis for a profile is very similar to a thesis for a critical reflection. And that's so, and I've talked a little bit before about reflection and critical reflection. So reflection is just you reflecting on an event for no critical reason besides the purpose of reflecting on, I shouldn't just say an event, on something. I'll just say something. So when you're doing reflection, you're just reflecting on something for the sole purpose of reflecting. When you're doing critical reflection, you are analyzing, or I should say using reflection as a means to analyze why something or someone from that reflection caused something to happen. That's a very broad definition, but it's essentially the thesis for the profile is the exact same as the thesis that you would anticipate in a critical reflection, right? So, and once I actually give you an idea of what the thesis would look like for my profile of a place with this particular event, I'll explain how it would be like a critical reflection thesis. And so what I would say is that, and I kind of sketched one out here a little bit. It's not going to be perfectly written, but I'm just going to go ahead and write it. So I would say Maya Angelou's graduation speech, I can't type now, at my brother's, well, I could say, see, I'm going to revise as I'm writing, which I don't like doing. Speech at my brother's college graduation in 2002, again, maintaining that specificity. Transformed my path in life, and it was, I hate the way I write this, but it's a first draft, and it was listening to her speak, both the words she used and how she spoke them, that inspired me to take a different, or inspired me to go a certain, or I'll just be even more specific, to return to school, to seek my degree in English. And that's true. So that's a thesis. It's a badly written thesis. I would revise that a little bit to make it more polished. But this is just to give you an idea of what a thesis for something like this would look like. And And it's critical reflection because I'm reflecting back on an event. And so in my description of this event, I would talk about, the place. So it was at UIUC, which is where both my brother and I went for our undergrads. This is in the University of Illinois. So the place, I would talk about why Maya Angelou was there to begin with. She was there because she was at UIUC when 9/11 happened, and she returned for the graduating class in 2002 because she felt connected to them. She had been on campus when 9/11 happened, and she decided that she wanted to go back because she had experienced this, tragedy with this particular community of people. So she was there for a particular reason. I would describe the space, so the auditorium that the graduation was held in. I would describe the people, mostly my view, and I still, to this day, this many years later, my view of the students graduating. And I would kind of talk about, what my view of them was in terms of what I actually saw in the space. And then I would describe her speech, or at least my memory of her speech. And I would talk about her tone, her words, the length, how people listened, how quiet, the space was. It was such an enormous space. It was the, basketball arena where the graduation took place, and everyone was just, you could hear a pin drop, and there were thousands and thousands of people. So it was a very powerful moment. Not just that it was Maya Angelou, but getting to hear her speak and getting to hear her speak under, this context when 9/11 had happened not that long ago, and then watching my brother graduate, and then because then I would also I would describe my my kind of position at that time. So I had a BFA in studio arts and was working as a gallery resident in Chicago, but I was unhappy and didn't know what I wanted to do. So when I went to hear Maya Angelou speak, that was kind of the turning point. It was the turning point in deciding to go back to school to get my second BA, or my second bachelor's, which I got in English, and I've been doing English ever since. So these are the different things that I would talk about. There's other things I could add to this list. I remember what I was wearing. I remember, the people who were there with me. I remember, taking pictures there. There's a lot I remember. And the more you think about a situation, the more you remember, if you just kind of put yourself in that position. So, and then I would go back to this thesis, right? So this is all reflection, right? If I just talked about all of this by itself, that would be reflection. That would be, I'm going to tell you about the time I heard Maya Angelou speak because I'm doing it for the sake of telling you about this particular situation. If I were doing critical reflection, which is what Profile of a Place is, I'm reflecting on all of this for a particular reason, and I'm reflecting on it to talk about how this particular moment in my life was a turning point and explaining why. So describing this event, describing the situations that took place around that event, why it happened, why she was there, how I was there, the other people who were there, what my current kind of situation was in life at that time. And I'm now reflecting on all of this, not just as reflection, but I'm reflecting on it as a way to explain or inform or talk about how reflecting on that has led me to believe or led me to understand that it was that moment in my life that was the turning point. That's critical reflection. So hopefully that explains the difference between reflection and critical reflection. And again, I'm talking about the profile of a place assignment in the terms of reflection and critical reflection, because the profile genre is a reflection within the reflection genre. And so talking about explaining what the thesis is for a profile, it's best for me to do that, or it's easiest for me to do that in the sorry, now I'm lost for words. It's easiest for me to talk about it in terms of reflection and critical reflection, because usually people are common with or familiar with the idea of reflection, but they get lost between, well, what's the difference between reflection and critical reflection? And then that's where the thesis can get really difficult. And hopefully explaining this would help people understand the difference between why am I talking about this event, right? I'm not just talking about it for the sake of talking about it. I'm talking about it in order to make an assessment or assertion or argument about something, right? Because this is also arguably an argument. I could argue this. Even though I wrote it, I could say, maybe that wasn't the turning point. There were also these other things that happened, right, that led up to that. So I could also be making an argument myself. So that's everything. Those are the 3 chapters that you had to talk about this week, and the different assignments, particularly the profile of a place. Don't forget that you want to, those responses to classmates, you don't forget to do those. There's been a handful of students who are posting the original post, but then forgetting to respond to classmates. So you want to remember, for all of those different assignments, you want to read through very carefully the criteria for the assignments, and making sure that you are replying to classmates. You don't have to do that for the profile of a place. I believe you do have to do that for, I just want to double check before I sign off on this really long screencast now. For the using sense details, let's take a quick look at that, because I can't remember exactly which ones are asking you to respond. Okay, right, so here we go. So these activities are set up using the discussion tool, so you can share your activities with your classmates. So replies to your classmates' posts are not required for these activities. Please, or feel free to ask them questions or share further ideas. And they are graded as pass-fail. So I apologize if there's banging. My cat's trying to get in a cupboard. So you don't have to respond. And I just want to double check all of them. That was the using sense details and the use of personal anecdotes. This one, you do have to respond to at least 2 postings, so 2 classmates. So the personal anecdotes assignment in particular, you want to make sure you respond, and it's strongly encouraged for you to respond to the using sensory details assignment, even though responding to classmates is not required in that. And that's just to help help cultivate the sense of conversation and connection in the course. So that's everything I have for today. You can expect my next video lecture on Monday or Tuesday for Module 3. As I said before, I will per somebody's request and recommendation, while I can't get it as early as Sunday due to the weeks in terms of writing or literature courses, it's more difficult to do. But I will get that video lecture earlier in the week. Other than that, I hope everybody has a great weekend, and I will talk to everybody soon. Bye-bye.